are still entering the room, but I'll get started with our introductions. Welcome to the YWCA Stand Against Racism series. And this is the First Amendment in a time of crisis. And I am so thankful to have all of you as part of this very important conversation. As part of this YW series, we always say that we are inviting the public to a very safe forum to have very open, transparent, and sometimes difficult conversations. And this one I think is more timely than most. I will say that when I entered Vanderbilt Law School in 1981, I found the study of constitutional law one of the most intriguing and interesting portions of my law school experience. It is something that I often told my husband at that time, that I truly was wishing that every member of our community had the experience of going through a constitutional law class. I think it would substantially change our public discussions. And so it is a pleasure that I'm given this opportunity to have such a talented group of panelists to discuss just one of the amendments to the Constitution that is part of our Bill of Rights. Now, I won't go into a separation of powers and all that sort of thing, and hopefully you all can look that up because I don't think that many people understand how that works. We have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And oftentimes, our Constitution and the amendments to our constitutions are viewed in light of what happens with that very important judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court. But everyone understands we have a constitution, but a lot of people do not understand the reason we have the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, is because there was a little bit of controversy in even passing the Constitution, because you have to look at the history of where our country was. And there was a desire not to be in an oppressive state. So a lot of the things that our founders came up with as far as the Bill of Rights are things that they thought were important. Now that was in what, 1791, and we're in 2021. But these words, as they've been interpreted and as they have changed over time, have become more important than ever. So we're going to start off with our panelists introducing themselves, because each of them have a perspective and expertise in this area. And it's very important to listen and to understand the First Amendment. I'm going to read very briefly the actual language. Now, with the understanding, I talked about the judicial branch. Many of these words have been interpreted, they've been broadened, they've been narrowed, they've been changed, they've been flipped. Everything that can happen has happened within these words. First of all, it says, the text of the Bill of Rights, the actual words that were written in 1791, First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Those are very grand words, and I'm glad that they wrote them. However, we're going to have a little conversation now about what this means in today's world. Question number one. I'll start off with our panelists. Please introduce yourselves, including who you are and how your work relates to First Amendment rights or limitations. I'll start with David.
Hi, my name is David L Hudson Jr. I'm a professor at Belmont University Law School. I'm also a First Amendment Fellow for the Freedom Forum Institute in Washington, D.C., and a First Amendment Fellow for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is based in Philadelphia. And for 17 years, I worked exclusively at the First Amendment Center at Vanderbilt University. So the First Amendment's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. It's what I write about. It's what I care about deeply. And I'm just honored to be able to be on this panel with such distinguished people. And thank you for having me. In my daily work, I guess I write stories. So I'm kind of a legal journalist per se about different First Amendment issues. And then occasionally I'll get involved in a First Amendment lawsuit every now and then. So that's kind of how I'm involved with it.
Okay, Brandon.
Hey, I'm Brandon Tucker, Policy Director for the ACLU of Tennessee. Um, Words being suppressed or criminalized either by those advocating for workers' rights or women's rights or racial equality is pretty much the backdrop of the ACLU's existence. And, we've been part of virtually every landmark First Amendment case to reach the Supreme Court. But my work specifically in an organization steeped in advocacy for the First Amendment is to engage or my work specifically engages legislative and non-legislative advocacy in support of free expression, right to protest, and free speech. And what that looks like is right now lobbying to roll back provisions of the anti-protest law passed last year. And we have legislation introduced, Senate Bill 1547, to do just that, trying to defeat the onslaught of anti-protest legislation that's currently at our General Assembly. Bills like Senate Bill 843 that offer immunity for drivers if they hit and kill a protester in the street. Our legal department, is always ready to defend the First Amendment in the courts. And my role is to try my very best to ensure the legislature thinks twice before passing lawsuits disguised as legislation. So that's my connection to the First Amendment.
Okay, and Professor Hans.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gotham Hans. I'm an assistant clinical professor at Vanderbilt in the law school where I run our First Amendment clinic. It's a real pleasure to be here today to speak with you and to be on this wonderful panel of experts. I hope to match the expertise that others provide. The clinic that I run represents individuals in free speech cases who can't otherwise afford legal counsel as well as organizations. So we have done litigation on behalf of individuals and organizations in the state and federal courts in Tennessee. We also do other kinds of advocacy, like legislative advocacy and amicus brief writing and policy work, thinking about how we can promote freedom of the speech, press, and association. So that's sort of my main job at Vanderbilt. I also do a fair amount of research and writing and speaking to the press and on panels like this as someone who has been thinking a lot about privacy and free speech and surveillance for many years, as well as how it intersects with civil rights, LGBTQ equality, racial justice, women's rights, and the like. I think we are increasingly seeing a need for more intersectional and sophisticated understandings of how these different areas of the law interact. And I think it's really important to bring that to bear. And I'm sure that will be a part of our discussion today.
All right, thank you so much. Now, there's an old adage about war, and I do believe the United States is at war with itself. We have an internal war that's probably more threatened than most every external war we have faced. And the old adage is that truth is the first casualty in war. And so we have to make sure that people understand there are certain truths that are part of our society that we have to protect. So we're going to really look at one slice of what the First Amendment does. And during these times of racial tension and also tensions among sexuality, we are bombarded with racist, sexist, and homophobic statements. These statements come from many sources, including news outlets and now social media. It is no wonder why the discussions surrounding the First Amendment are front and center. While on its face, the First Amendment legally protects the freedoms of speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly, and it's very broadly written. And it's often used as an excuse for racist and hate speech. We also know that there have been numerous exceptions to this freedom since 1919. What arguments can be made that the protections seemably afforded by the First Amendment should not protect hate speech? I'll start with Professor Hans.
Oh, I get the easy question, huh? So there's a lot of, maybe at a fundamental level, I think it's important to establish like what the sort of guidelines are. I really agree with the point that constitutional law is something that doesn't always get as much, isn't always as clear to the public. And I think that's probably the fault of people like me, law professors, who don't, speak clearly and concisely. So the First Amendment is a limitation on the government and not on private parties. What it means is that the government is limited in how it can regulate speech, assembly, protests. There's also the religion clauses, which I know we're not talking about today. That's a whole other ball of wax. But it doesn't have much, or it has very little to say about private companies and what private companies can do to regulate speech. So the newspaper doesn't have to follow the First Amendment. Social media doesn't have to follow the First Amendment. They may use those principles, but they're not required to by dint of the Constitution. The reasons that the courts have struck down many hate speech regulations on First Amendment grounds, there's a whole number of reasons, but one of them has to do with definitions. When we talk, what hate speech means, I think, is a very hard category to pin down with specificity, and it's also an evolving category. We've talked a little bit about LGBTQ rights already. That's something that has really in American law only gained prominence in recent decades as a category of speech and a protection. So the courts are very unwilling to create boundaries upon speech that are vague because of concerns about overbreadth or lack of clarity, or the possibility that people will be swept up into the regulation of speech that wasn't intended. We have a very pro-speech court system and country compared to other other nations, and that is part of the reason that hate speech has not been regulated very effectively or even permissibly by the courts. I think, of course, there's lots of policy arguments that we can make about whether or not we think that's good or not. But I think we probably all will agree that our court system, especially recently, has been very pro-speech, and that means that regulations of speech are treated very skeptically by the courts.
Okay, thank you, Brandon.
I'm glad I didn't have to go first. No, look, I have a lot of these conversations, and with peers and also with students, and I recognize my sincere belief is unpopular, but keeping in mind though that my beliefs and my values is pretty unpopular to a whole swath of Tennesseans, and also it's unpopular to many at the Tennessee legislature. So I think, leaving some of the legalese discussion out of this, as the professor has spoken so eloquently too, we need to exercise real caution when we invite judgment on points of view. Outside of speech which intends to produce or incite violence, I hope there will be no restrictions on speech we abhor or disagree with. If it's and the ACLU of Tennessee disagrees, vehemently with the words and symbols and acts of white supremacists and racists who spew their vile rhetoric any and everywhere, but that speech is protected speech. And if it's up to the government to just determine what's proper, what is hate, what is appropriate, who do we think would be singled out? And I have a strong inclination it wouldn't be the white supremacist. It would be the Black Lives Matter movement. It would be individuals in the street advocating for immigration reform, or advocating for LGBT equality. And so, speech that's not connected to inciting violence or threatening, we have to be extremely cautious with trying to suppress the ideas of individuals or groups. And so, in allowing for hate speech to exist. I think it's one of the surest ways we guarantee that generation after generation will continue fighting to end systemic racism and the continuation of advocating for fairness and systemic equity. But hate speech sharpens the tactics and the words and the values of the next Black Lives Matter movement, of the next pro workers movement, the next movement that tries to be inclusive of all genders and all sexual orientations. That's why those arguments are so succinct, because they've heard the bigotry, they've heard the hate and the racism, and so the marketplace of ideas requires both ignorance and educated views. So that's my position on trying to suppress speech we disagree with.
All right, David.
Yeah, I agree with my panelists. Hate speech can be prohibited in narrow circumstances. And you mentioned earlier, Sharon, that there are narrow, unprotected categories of speech that are not protected. And the three that come to mind with regard to hate speech are incitement to imminent lawless action, true threats, and fighting words. Those are still all exceptions to the First Amendment. So if hate speech constitutes fighting words, which is defined as words which by their very utterance inflict injury or cause an immediate breach of the peace, that can be prohibited. If hate speech constitutes a true threat, which is a serious expression to inflict bodily harm from a reasonable person's point of view, that can be prohibited. And as Brandon said, if hate speech meets the so-called Brandenburg standard, if it incites imminent lawless action and is likely to do so, it also can be prohibited. Those are narrow, unprotected categories of speech, however, and I think there are problems with regulating speech based on viewpoint. The most fundamental free speech principle in First Amendment jurisprudence is that the government should not be discriminating on the basis of viewpoint. With regard to hate speech, I wholeheartedly agree with Professor Hans when he says that there's a definitional problem. Every attempt most attempts that have been made to regulate hate speech, what is hate speech? Oftentimes the definitions are vague and overbroad. If a law is too vague, it requires people to necessarily guess at its meaning, and that's a concept that is also rooted in the Due Process Clause. Oftentimes, hate speech laws are too broad. In addition to sweeping up speech that can be prohibited, it also regulates or prescribes speech which ought to be protected. And there's a very important principle in First Amendment law called the counter-speech doctrine. It's something that the ACLU has advanced through the years, in addition to the marketplace of ideas that Brandon mentioned. It's traced back to Justice Louis Brandeis in Whitney v. California, when he wrote something to the effect, if there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evils by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. So when we as a society are confronted with harmful and hateful speech, our first response should not be necessarily to censor it or drive it underground, but to counter it and show why it's wrong. And that's why Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in United States versus Swimmer, it's freedom for the thought that we hate.
Yes, thank you, Professor Hudson. I'm going to go a little bit off script because we have one question at the end, because I wanted to bring this up. And this is something that Brandon, you brought up. I had the privilege of knowing Dr. Benjamin Hooks, and I worked with a matter with him, and the matter sort of turned sideways on him because he actually called us in as regulators to review an issue, and it did not turn out well for the party that was being reviewed. And he says, you always have to watch because you can get hit with the stick you swung. And that's sort of what Brandon is saying, because I think that sometimes we have to look as a community at some of the restrictions we want for speech we personally do not like, but it could lead to the restrictions on speech that we want to have out in the community. Professor Hudson, can you talk more about that issue on how often we see restrictions wanted for speech that we personally like, but do not want speech that we dislike, that we find very unappealing. We want that to be censored.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in theory, it's what I refer to it to my students as a dissonance between the First Amendment ideal and the First Amendment real. You know, ideally, we want to celebrate all speech and extol it and allow all viewpoints into the marketplace. But in reality, there is always some speech that we want to censor, right? It's what Nat Hentoff famously described as free speech for me, but not for thee. And I think what Brandon's getting at, you know, to give another concrete example, when the University of Michigan adopted a speech code, which was designed really to prohibit racially harassing speech, 16 of the first 20 students that they punished under that speech code were African-American students. Mm-hmm. And that's terrible. And I think the other point that we need to stress here is that free speech rights really are supposed to be indivisible. Quick example, one of the cases the ACLU handled back in the day was Terminello versus City of Chicago, 1949. A guy named Arthur Terminello gives this racist speech to an audience, and he's convicted for inducing unrest and breaching the peace, and the Supreme Court protected his speech. Well, in the 1960s, the United States Supreme Court protected the speech of Fred Shuttlesworth, Dick Gregory, Ben Elton Cox, in seminal free speech cases that arose in the context of the civil rights movement. And what case was cited in every one of those decisions? Terminello versus City of Chicago. So the free speech principle and that protected the racist in Terminello versus City of Chicago was used to protect the free speech rights of civil rights activists.
Okay. Brandon, do you have anything else to add to that?
Not too much. I mean, I think the only thing I add is that, you know, we're dealing with it this week. We're dealing with the legislature and a supermajority party trying to engage what's happening at East Tennessee State University, where basketball players decided that it was important to them to continue the advocacy for racial equality. And, you know, to be clear, these students can say and react how they want, as long as it, you know, does not disrupt the learning process. But the Supreme Court has decided this nearly 80 years ago. And so, you know, I think what I was alluding to and what we've all been alluding to is that the government has tried, and we've seen this week, consistently trying to suppress the symbolic speech or free expression of those they disagree with. And that's why it's important to be open and welcome to all ideas and all expressions of that symbolic speech. And taking a knee is within their constitutional rights. And so this is not, you know, a conversation that is far gone in the past. We see an example of this week, today, from the Tennessee legislature.
You know, I would just say that it's of course unfortunate timing that this is happening, although in Tennessee, I feel like the legislature gives us a free speech problem every week for us to be frustrated about. You know, one thing that I'm thinking a lot about these days is that fundamentally we're talking about a social problem, which is, I think, part of the reason that we're having this panel in the first place is, you know, it's why YWCA is being a community organization. And lawyers have a bad tendency to see everything through a legal lens, and that the law is a solution to all sorts of problems. Often it can be, you know, law can be a mediating force to deal with inequity or discrimination. But here, I don't think that law is ever really going to provide a good solution to the issues that we're really concerned about. Irrespective of all the other concerns that have been named, I find it really hard to believe that we're going to deal with white supremacy, with sexism, with LGBTQ discrimination, all the other social problems we have that speech enables through legal mechanism. They're really intractable, and laws and regulations are, even if I don't have a lot of faith in their ability to address those, and I have real concerns about the ways that they can be misused or targeting vulnerable or historically marginalized groups. David mentioned the U of M issue, which I think goes to another question, is that these are not new debates, unfortunately. I think many of us who have been thinking about speech issues are feeling that this is just another cycle of a long-running issue, like the campus speech codes of the late 80s and 90s being a great example, where we're really struggling to think about how to deal with viewpoints that are not just unpopular, but hostile and with serious consequences.
Okay. We know that there are individual ways of speaking, individuals that make certain statements and those things and the protections that are there. But there's also commercial speech and how commercial speech is regulated. And I want to touch on that, and I would like for each one of you to sort of give me a little bit about that issue, because our founders did not have, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all of those things were not part of anyone's even imagination at that time. We were dealing mostly, with a little bit of press and commercial speech, and those commercial speech and then press are two different things. But can someone touch on that to sort of give a little bit of an education on how that is restricted and how that is free? Professor Hans?
Yeah, so really briefly, commercial speech having to do with the rights of companies to advertise and sort of the ways in which that has been used as a way to avoid regulation is a relatively recent history, I think going back to the mid-70s. But what that means practically is complicated, as you note, because private entities have speech rights, and that's the reason that the New York Times and the Tennessean can choose what to publish, and they're not subject to government regulation. The challenge has been that when we hear about sort of the growth of the First Amendment in the courts, what that has meant is that many companies and entities have brought First Amendment claims to avoid regulation. Citizens United is a very popular example of this, but there are many others. There was a case a few years ago about labor union fees. There are issues about privacy regulation where individuals or companies raise free speech arguments as to why those laws are invalid. I am pretty concerned about that turn. Others view it as the sort of appropriate interpretation of the First Amendment, but it is, I think it is the case that when states or the federal government pass regulations, many people will see, is there a First Amendment angle for us to try to invalidate this, because the courts are particularly receptive to those arguments in recent years.
Okay, Brandon, anything to add?
I don't think I don't have much to add to the professor's comments. I think going forward, the ACLU and our legal departments, are remaining vigilant and trying to stay ahead of the curve as speech rights infringe upon or creep steadily make their way toward suppressing the rights of whether it be a company or large social media platforms and their ability to advertise. But it's something that I don't focus on day to day at the Tennessee legislature, but it's something that within our First Amendment project in our office here, constantly staying vigilant and mindful of.
All right, Professor Hudson.
Yeah, I mean, commercial speech doctrine, I guess, in 1942, the United States Supreme Court said the Constitution does not prohibit any restraint on commercial advertising at all. And as Professor Hans said, that did not change until the mid-1970s. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court essentially established what's known as the Central Hudson test, which essentially is that the government has a free rein to prohibit commercial speech, which is defined as speech which does no more than propose a commercial transaction, right? X product for Y Y price. If speech is false or concerns unlawful activities, the government can regulate it. If, however, it's truthful, non-misleading speech about lawful activities, then before the government can regulate commercial speech, it has to have a substantial governmental interest. The regulation has to directly and materially advance the government's substantial interest, and the law has to be narrowly tailored. Now, why is that an issue in the First Amendment community? Well, there are some who believe that in a commercialized culture, in a capitalistic society, that the free flow of commercial information should not be censored. And so Justice Clarence Thomas, for example, famously declared in 1996, I do not see a philosophical or historical justification for treating commercial speech worse than, truthful commercial speech worse than non-commercial speech. The first problem that we have is a definitional one, right? When is speech purely commercial speech? When is it part commercial and part political? And the example I like to give to my students is New York Times Company versus Sullivan, 1964, the most celebrated First Amendment decision in the history of the United States Supreme Court. That involved an editorial advertisement in March of 1960 called Heed Their Rising Voices, which talked about civil rights abuses in the South. The argument, one of the arguments in that case by the state of Alabama, the Alabama officials, was that this editorial advertisement is purely commercial speech and therefore deserves no First Amendment protection. And Justice Brennan in Times v. Sullivan says, whoa, wait a second. This is not purely commercial speech. It concerns grievances about the biggest issue of public concern in modern America, namely civil rights and the abuse of people. So there continues to be a definitional problem as to what exactly is commercial speech. The other danger I foresee, and I've seen particularly in the context of regulating attorney advertising, is that when the government declares that something, oh, that's misleading, or that's potentially misleading, that is, to borrow Professor Hans's phrase, that is susceptible to misuse by the government.
Yeah, I agree. We had a question from one of our audience members, and this really goes to a specific case that she would like to use. I think is informative on why this conversation is so important, but also to point out some of the ramifications of actions. But in 1978, a neo-Nazi group marched in Skokie, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago with a large Jewish population. The ACLU at that time took what was a controversial position and defended the neo-Nazi group that wanted to march to the Chicago suburb because even though there were Holocaust survivors, it was very sensitive. They felt as though this was a right for free speech. Subsequent to that, well, for that particular case, they invoked the positions they had taken with some civil rights activists. Professor Hahn, was this the right call? Was there something now that we move forward? That was 78, we're in 2021. Does that position still hold up?
You know, I see that Hetty Weinberg from the ACLU is on, so I would hesitate to speak on behalf of the ACLU, an organization I love and have interned at, but because I think that this is a really complicated issue, and I think I don't want to air dirty laundry, but I think the Charlottesville story is for many of us sort of an interesting parallel to the Skokie case. I was talking with a friend of mine, I think last week, about this. Would the ACLU take that case today? I don't know the answer to that. I think that there are a few important things to know. I think it was Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who I think some may know is the delegate from the District of Columbia, had been an ACLU attorney prior to her government service, and I think also represented similarly sort of unpopular plaintiffs in these cases. So, you know, there's a long history of this even before the Skokie case. I think one big difference from my understanding of the Skokie case is that it was an incredibly unpopular view, and they had no other, my knowledge is that they didn't really have other options in terms of who would represent them. I don't think that's the case today. I think that there are many groups that are really concerned about First Amendment rights with a variety of perspectives about what the right call is on those rights. So I don't think that there would be such a lack of representation as there was at the time. But I go back to the points that we've been making today. Part of the concern that we all have about free speech regulations is, yes, today you're preventing the neo-Nazis and the Nazis from protesting, and tomorrow is going to be Black Lives Matter that you have to represent as well. I just don't think that the government is always going to be tempted to go after viewpoints that they consider unpopular. And, as we've mentioned already, the Tennessee legislature is chomping at the bit to do that. And so I don't think that we can really have a lot of faith that we can say one group is, one that we won't represent. First Amendment cases very rarely have popular plaintiffs at their center. And that's just part of the challenge.
Okay, Brandon, you can recuse yourself, but you can.
Gotham said, because Hetty's on, he doesn't want to speak for the ACLU. I don't even want to speak for the ACLU right now. No, look, we are, as an organization, going to constantly be in the crosshairs of our own supporters, those who we 95% align with on all the issues that we work on and advocate for. But it is these controversial instances where the ACLU, either, as the professor acknowledged, is the sole entity to represent a group or an organization to advocate for their free speech rights, or more controversially, kind of volunteers and puts themselves at the forefront of representation for those with affluence, those with means, and so I think we have had so much conversation on our role and the necessity that the ACLU step in to protect these organizations that we completely disagree with, and their right to permits and their right to march. And so, we've learned a lot from 4 or 5 years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. We have made clarifications that, when there are weapons involved in marches, the ACLU is drawing a line and saying that our representation isn't appropriate here. We've had complete deliberations as well if individual organizations trying to use us when they have the complete potential to go hire private counsel or some other law firm. And so, the controversial cases will always be there. I think it's going to be case by case basis to determine the appropriateness of the ACLU and our legal representation for those groups we disagree with. But it's just something that has been and will continue to be a necessity for our voice to be injected in the advocacy of the freedom of expression for all individuals and all groups. And, we're not going to be the most popular group at all times, and our own members, our own supporters are going to disagree with the stances that the ACLU takes often, but it's for a principled position to ensure that the groups that we want to be in lockstep with have the ability to speak tomorrow.
Okay, Professor Hudson.
I agree with my panelists. Professor Hans mentioned Eleanor Holmes Norton. She was one of the attorneys of record in Brandenburg versus Ohio. Clarence Brandenburg was a KKK leader. When she was questioned about that, she said, it's the principle. It's the higher principle. It's the principle of freedom of speech. And as Brandon said, somebody has to take up the cause of controversial speakers and controversial cases, and the ACLU should be applauded for that. The courage that the American Civil Liberties Union has shown in defending unpopular causes should be applauded. It was Justice Felix Frankfurter who said, if I may quote this very quickly, I may mess the quote up a little bit, but I remember this one from law school, United States v. Rabinowitz, a dissenting opinion. He said, it's a fair summary of history that many of our most important constitutional freedoms have been forged in the name of some not very nice people. You know, the First Amendment sometimes protects the hate monger, it protects the flag burner, it protects the tobacco merchant, but it also protects all of us. And the ACLU ought to be applauded for its courage.
Okay, and this goes to what we've been saying about how we have to be very careful as a society what we try to restrict. Now, I want to get into an area, and y'all are so well versed in this, you could do anything off the top of your head. But this is getting into that arena of defamation, how people are just, there's a well-established cases of what you can and cannot say that has really limited free speech in the area of defamation, because it seems as though people are just saying anything. I would say, can you say anything now about someone and not suffer any consequence or not having anything happen to you? I'll start with you, Professor Hans. You seem kind of energized when I brought it up.
Well, it's in part because the answer is yes. I mean, I think that defamation remains, a viable cause of action, but in pretty limited circumstances. David had mentioned New York Times versus Sullivan, and that has really limited how states can allow defamation claims to go forward. And in Tennessee, we recently enacted a law that helps to protect speech rights, because defamation claims often can be very expensive to litigate. And so now there is a procedural way that defendants can say, look, this claim is just brought because someone didn't like what I said. And that's not something that we want the law to resolve. It goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, that the law is not always a solution to social problems. And here we see sometimes people, the internet is a great example of this, where people will say like, oh, someone said something about me I didn't like, and I'm going to file a defamation claim. Well, that is not, I think, an appropriate way to have public discourse, because you're basically using the threat of a lawsuit in order to try to shut down public participation in public discourse. We've seen this a lot. I think some people may be familiar with online reviews, like on Yelp or on Google, where a business will say, well, this patient or this customer didn't like me and you have to take down this review, or this review is defamatory, when in fact it is often opinion, which is perfectly permissible under our free speech law. I think this is, again, where the law of unintended consequences could give a good object lesson for why we would want to be concerned about broad defamation claims, because can any of us say that someone might not want to file a lawsuit against us for something that we've said in private? I probably said things today that I don't want people to file lawsuits against me about. And I think that we all can think, if we think a little bit more about what expansive liability would mean for how we express ourselves in the world, I think it would make many of us quite nervous.
Okay, Brandon?
There's so many experts on here. And I'm not an expert, but there are protections in place for this, libelous or false statements as it pertains to like public officials I just, Professor Hans mentioned that, do you really want a cause of action against things stated toward a person or entity that they just don't like? There are there are mechanisms though for accusations and false information to be dealt with in the courts. But I think where the question may have started is, can the person just say anything about anything on Twitter or Facebook? And there's certainly an actual legal line, but I don't think we need to always jump to the legality of individuals just expressing their viewpoint about an entity or a person, which may be disagreeable. But there are protections in place.
Okay, Professor Hudson.
Yeah, look, defamation is a viable tort action in society. It includes both libel and slander. If you make a false statement of fact about somebody that harms their reputation, you are subject to being sued for defamation. And the reason why we are seeing a proliferation of defamation suits is because there's been an expansion of speech in general in social media, and people get on Facebook or Twitter and just say any darn thing about somebody else, and you can't do that. If somebody gets on Facebook and says David Hudson is a convicted sex offender, that's a false statement of fact. It could harm my reputation, and I could sue them. As my co-panelist said, there are a variety of defenses, but I think with rights come responsibilities, and you can't just say anything about somebody. You can't do that. Now, one defense that does come up a lot, I'll mention that, as Brandon said, they're just we need a couple hours to get through all this. But one that has come into play a lot is rhetorical hyperbole. So I may use very loose figurative language to describe somebody. This is actually a doctrine that former President Donald Trump benefited from in several cases, right? Because he used such loose language. But if, for example, I attended a school board meeting and I thought that a school board member was acting in an overly authoritarian fashion, and I said something like, that school board member is a Nazi. Well, look, they may say, well, that's a false statement of fact. I'm not a member of the Nazi party, and I don't subscribe to any ideologies associated with Adolf Hitler. But the defendant may say, well, that's really rhetorical hyperbole. You're just using that loose figurative language that, it's often been used by sports writers as a defense, for example, as rhetorical hyperbole.
Okay, and that makes sense, but the key is the truth of what you're saying. It is, but like you said, the language can end up such that someone could say it's false, and so and it could very well be questionable or an opinion, and people have to make sure that they do not try to hinder the freedom of speech of your opinion, because as I said and I learned, you can get hit with that stick.
I think part of the problem, and this is something I've been thinking about in the last few days, is that there's a lot of frustration, like I said, about the state of social discourse. I share it, but the people or the organizations we should be targeting are not the ones that often come first to mind. Social media, many people have been, harassed and really mistreated on these platforms. I think there's just all sorts of evidence to that, but the issue there is not the First Amendment. It's the platforms themselves, right? It's the companies that create products and tools and are not very thoughtful about how to protect vulnerable users, protect those who, are the targets of unpopular or discriminatory or negative speech. The First Amendment is not going to be the solution to that. It's better governance, it's better policies from these platforms and these companies that really would be the better target of social activism and pressure. Constantly, people who, like me, who are really following these issues closely, just see stories of mismanagement or of political choices being made where the companies are not being consistent or clear about what their lines are, or not creating tools that would effectively allow users to control the sort of flow of information inwards, and are very slow about rolling those things out. That's where the problem lies. I don't think it's where the First Amendment, what it does or doesn't allow, is really the culprit. But of course, it's very difficult to sort of influence these companies because of the ways in which American capitalism is structured. I often say, well, it's really just capitalism that's the problem, which maybe is an even more abstract principle to be against, but that's probably another conversation.
Yeah, we do need another conversation. I always say the economics that supports capitalism is the issue. that's a whole other conversation. But with that said, I'm going to go to each of you, because we always try to have a call to action, short and long term. It's to give our audience some hope or something that they can do on an individual or group basis to make sure that we hold really the ideals of the First Amendment, which there's a lot of freedom there. And I think that is part, and a very positive part, of being part of the American society. But we want the First Amendment to be a tool that will help us. But we also know that we're facing a system where we have white supremacy, we have racial injustice, we have, sexual injustices in our society. So how do we strike that balance? What would you advise someone that wants things to be better, but coupled with the need to have the freedom that the First Amendment gives us? Professor Hans?
You know, I think this is really where activism and organizing, which are facilitated by the First Amendment, are really necessary. I saw that there was a question about what we can do to pressure legislators to focus on real problems. And I think, you know, applying pressure is in fact one of them. I think there's been a lot of critical reporting and advocacy around the legislature's recent moves to try to, you know, punish protesters and punish students for exercising their rights and for taking a stand. And I think that, you know, again, I don't know how much effect that will have, but at least it has become an issue that receives further attention, and perhaps we'll get some, you know, better thoughts and more more careful deliberation about what's appropriate for our legislative bodies to be working on. I think that I was really heartened and impressed by so many of the activists last summer who were standing up for racial justice and for the inequities we see in our state and unfortunately across the US. And I think that is where activism, local activism, community-based work can really work to educate not only our communities about what the First Amendment does, why it's important, and also to call out you know, those who are trying to limit those rights, because it's really a foundational democratic principle in my mind.
All right, Brandon?
Yeah, I'll be short. David mentioned earlier about combating hate speech or with more speech, and I wholeheartedly subscribe to the belief of more speech, speaking out, putting oneself in the arena, to be active, to be in relationship or in partnership with those individuals who have been speaking out on systemic oppression. And so on top of more speech, the additional call would be for consistency. You know, what we've learned from some of our greatest civil rights activists, for example, John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, is cautioned against uh, movements with that were not consistent, that were not in it for the long haul, because progress comes slowly, and it will come even slower if we are only engaged and active for 3 weeks over the summer. It requires us to be involved in the arena year round, and in communication with allies, recognizing our commonalities, recognizing that we have the same fight, and getting in lockstep with groups that may not be harmed by exactly what you're advocating for. But we have to, you know, be in partnership, lock arms with one another, consistently speak out, and engage those who are in power, to slowly shift toward a more fair and just state in society.
Okay, Professor Hudson?
Yeah, I think the hope is that we do have a First Amendment that allows us to exercise our voice. So, for example, I am concerned about, I think the state of Tennessee is scheduled to execute Purvis Tyrone Payne. I am very concerned about, but I saw that Virginia, I believe, outlawed the death penalty, or at least there's a proposal in there, which is incredibly significant. Virginia was second in executions only to Texas. So let's say that I am opposed to the execution of Mr. Payne. I'm going to exercise my free petition rights, and I'm going to exercise my ability to write, and I'm going to try to make my voice heard on that. There are a lot of problems, for other problems in the criminal justice system. I want to exercise my free speech rights to support the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's group in Alabama. So there's so many ways that we as individuals can contribute positively to public debate. The other issue I would mention is that I think it's important for all of us to make a strong push for civic education. Yes. And the teaching of civic education to young people. There's this, we mentioned, Brandon alluded to West Virginia v. Barnett, the great flag salute case, which is so relevant to the lawmakers thing, the kneeling, right? Where the court said you can't force Jehovah's Witnesses or anybody else to stand and salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. But there's a line in there that resonates with me about, that they are educating the youth as reason for scrupulous protection of constitutional freedoms of the individual, lest we strangle the free mind at its source and teach youth to discount important principles of government as mere platitudes. And I think what we've got to do is educate young people that the First Amendment is a vital tool for all of us, and we need to realize that we can all exercise it to try to make positive change.
Most definitely. A couple of things before I want to make some closing statements. First of all, I would love to thank the Regions Foundation. They have underwritten this series, and really that's stepping out there on faith that our community is willing and ready to have these kinds of conversations. So I cannot say enough about thanking them. Also, we have a survey that we would like for individuals to fill out. We'll drop that into the chat. And the reason we're doing this is we want to do more of this. We want people to tell us what we're doing right and what we need to improve, because we want to make sure that we're giving these kinds of quality conversations to our community. So make sure it only takes about 2 to 3 minutes. But I also want to give, just to have a little few minutes, is there anything else that our panelists would like to tell this group? I will say this, Professor Blumstein would have been proud of me because I paid attention. I was very excited. I did my research. I did what I had to do to get through this. But this to me was phenomenal. It was exciting to me. We cannot say enough about this panelist. They were on their A game. So thank you so much. So anything else, David, one last word?
I just want to thank you for the opportunity. I want to thank Brandon for the ACLU. Just a wonderful organization. I want to thank Professor Hans. I owe him a phone call. I apologize to him because he emailed me a couple years ago, and he happened to email me right when I had a lot going on, and I never emailed you, but I would love to speak to students in the clinic on different First Amendment issues. And I so applaud both of these individuals because they're on the front lines defending the First Amendment rights of people, and just kudos to them. Okay,
Brandon?
The same thing. I want to thank you for moderating YWCA, and just having the opportunity to listen to David and Gotham. Such a wealth of knowledge, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm just happy to be here. So I appreciate y'all having me.
Professor Hans.
It's, of course it's turning into a love fest, but that's only, I think, because we have a lot of work to do, and we need as many allies as possible. And I think it's so wonderful that the YWCA has been doing these events, but particularly on this issue, which, as David mentioned, there's just a real lack of education. And I think this is really where the community itself can educate each other. And that is, I think, a more sustainable way to really promoting knowledge and activism. And on these issues and on so many, it really, I think, is wonderful to have a venue like this to talk to each other, to share knowledge, and to really promote the advancement of the causes that we all hold so dear, First Amendment or otherwise.
And I will say this, these organizations are here, they are part of our community. And so I say, if you have an interest in this area, support the people that are doing the work. Get out there with them. You may not could do anything else but write a letter or sign an envelope or mail something or even give a donation, but make sure you support these organizations because they're doing the work. And if there's nothing else that we need to understand, we need to understand our protections of our First Amendment rights. So thank you everyone for being here, and have a safe day. Thank you.
Thank you.